chose to research childhood suggestibility and how forensic interview protocols can be used to reduce the risk of suggestibility in sexual abuse cases. Because children are so prone to suggestibility, their courtroom testimony is vulnerable to suggestions made by the adults in their lives. This is problematic because often a child's testimony is the only evidence of sexual abuse. Forensic interview protocols reduce this risk because they are free from biases and misleading information, and thus they encourage the most accurate possible reports. I'll be talking about what happens when interviews go wrong, what is suggestibility, and why are children so vulnerable to it. I'll break down 2 different protocols and examine the strengths and limitations of each. I'll give an alternate perspective by discussing the current limitations of the research, and I will finish up with questions. So what happens when interviews go wrong? The daycare scare was a modern witch hunt of the mid-1980s to early 1990s. In the McMartin preschool case, 6 teachers were accused of sodomizing dozens of children by flying them to exotic locations where they were subject to satanic rituals of torture and murder. Despite no physical evidence, the 6 teachers were still charged with 208 counts of child abuse. It was the most expensive criminal case in U.S. history, and it lasted for 5 years before all the teachers were acquitted and all charges were dropped. In 1985, Kelly Michaels, a teacher at the We Care Daycare Center, was accused of cutting off children's genitalia, making them dance naked, and smearing peanut butter all over their bodies to make them lick it off each other. There was no physical evidence ever found except for a jar of peanut butter in the daycare center. She was still charged with 163 counts of child abuse and sentenced to 47 years in prison. But she was released on appeal 5 years later when the appellate court determined that the techniques that had been used to interview the children were completely unacceptable. So how could something like this happen? The adults were crying out, "Believe the children," because they thought that children were incorruptible vessels of truth who could not possibly lie, especially about sex, something they weren't supposed to know anything about. It was common at the time for interviews to be conducted by social workers who had no knowledge of criminal investigations, suggestibility, proper interviewing, or leading questions. These cases have been scrutinized to exhaustion to figure out what went wrong. This is a case study done by Schreiber and colleagues to compare the techniques used in both cases. In the McMartin preschool, the children were praised for being smart when they made accusations against their teachers. They were told that their secrets would magically disappear when they told them to the video camera, and they were given puppets and told to pretend what they thought might have happened. In the Kelly Michaels case, the investigators implied that the children were being bad if they didn't make accusations against Michaels. They threatened to tell the other children that the child didn't want to help them, and they told the children that they would never be allowed to go home until they told the investigators what they wanted to know. In both cases, the same questions were repeated over and over relentlessly. The adults cried, "Believe the children," but they wouldn't believe a child who said they had not been victimized. Instead, they questioned them relentlessly until they gave in. The children began having nightmares and stomach aches and displaying inappropriate sexual behaviors as a result of these interviews, but not before. It was not intentionalized, but an unconscious assimilation of false suggestions and pressures made by the adults who had access to the children. Children's testimony is at risk for errors and biases if the investigation is not done properly because of suggestibility. Suggestibility is the degree to which encoding, storage, and retrieval have been influenced by social and psychological factors. One reason for this is that children have a natural desire to be obedient, and they feel they're expected to answer every single question asked of them by an authority figure. If I asked you, "Is a paper cup sadder than an orange?" you wouldn't know how to answer such a nonsense question. In 1990, Chris Pratt asked a group of 5, 6, and 7-year-olds this same question, and 90% tried to answer because they were afraid to say they didn't know. Suggestibility is also influenced by cognitive and language factors. The brain is not a video corner. It is malleable like Play-Doh and can change your memories without you realizing it. What starts off as confabulation, which is you making up stories without the intent of deception, can turn to reconsolidation, where your memories all start to blend together, and eventually becomes an error with source monitoring, where you no longer remember where your memories came from. In language influences, children often have problems with pronoun confusion. If I asked a child, "What is my cat's name?" and they said, "I don't have a cat," they're confusing the pronouns mine and your. Often children who have less developed language are more susceptible to suggestibility because they don't have the words that they need to describe what they want to say. The most famous study in suggestibility is the Sam Stone study. In 1995, Lightman and Ceci had Sam Stone visit classrooms of 176 preschoolers. He did the same thing in every classroom. He said hello to the teacher, he commented on the book that was being read, and he said goodbye to the children, all in about 2 minutes. The children were divided into 4 groups. The control group, the stereotype group, which were told about Sam Stone's personality before he visited, with sentences like, "Oh, that's Sam Stone. He is so clumsy. He broke my doll when we were playing. Oh, but it's okay because he offered to fix it." And the suggestion group was reminded before questioning that Sam had ripped a book and soiled a teddy bear, and the stereotype suggestion group had both of these conditions. After 10 weeks, the children were interviewed with suggestive questioning such as, "When Sam Stone soiled a teddy bear, was it an accident or was it on purpose?" In the control group, 10% of the children made errors as a result of the suggestive questioning. 5% maintained they had seen Sam Stone do those things even after and 2% maintained they had seen him do those things even after they were challenged with, "But you didn't really see it, did you?" In the stereotype suggestion group, 72% of the children made errors as a result of the suggestive questioning. 51% said that they had seen Sam Stone do those things, and 21% maintained that he had done those things even after they were challenged with, "You didn't really see it." After the injustices of the McMartin Preschool and Kelly Michaels case, it became clear that the advice of suggested guidelines was not enough, and forensic interview protocols began to appear. A forensic interview is a structured conversation with the intent of bringing out detailed information the child may have experienced or witnessed. These can be applied to a wide range of situations and help keep the interviews consistent across all areas. The most widely researched protocol is the National Institute of Child Health and Development Protocol. It is a highly structured protocol with step-by-step instructions for each phase and suggested questions for each answer the child gives. It starts off with a rapport-building phase, goes into narrative training where the child is taught that it is okay to say, "I don't know." Episodic memory training where the child gets introduced to the question process. Open-ended questioning when the child actually talks about why they're there, and finishes with a de-escalation where the child is allowed to talk about anything else they want to. This reduces suggestibility because the child does most of the talking, and it includes specific instructions for the interviewer not to introduce any information the child has not already brought up. However, this is not reliable with children under 6 because of language difficulties, and it can be too lengthy for young children to sit through. The narrative elaboration technique protocol uses these 4 cue cards to instruct children on what they're supposed to talk about: participants, setting, actions, and conversations. These cards are supposed to help instruct the children about what the information the interviewer actually needs to know. It benefits children with language difficulties because it gives them a starting point from where they can talk. However, it pressures children into feeling like their answers aren't good enough when they're presented with a card and asked, "Does this card remind you to tell me anything more?" And it lacks a de-escalation to reduce the trauma. So the limitations on current research. 4 videos from the Sam Stone study, 1 from each group, were shown to a group of clinicians and researchers. They rated the child from the control group as the least credible, and the one from the stereotype suggestion group, the one with the 72% error rate, as the most credible. There is no clarity on distinguishing between truthful and untruthful responses in children. So despite all efforts to reduce suggestibility, the child still could not be telling the truth. And children with special needs are often overlooked for their forensic testimony and rated as unreliable because of their difficulty in creating a narrative account. Despite extensive research, there is no one method that improves the accuracy for children with special needs. In summary, there is no way to eliminate suggestibility completely, but the current forensic interview protocols improve over the techniques used in the daycare scare. Children are still very prone to suggestibility, and the current research gives no indication on how to tell conclusively when a child is telling the truth. All of the interview studies that have been done on these protocols have been done in controlled environments where the interviewers know all the answers, because there is no way to ethically test these protocols otherwise. However, these protocols give the best chance of finding the truth, because often the only evidence in a sexual abuse case is the child's testimony. And these protocols are helping to reduce the risk of injustices like the daycare scare from happening again. Any questions?
For the protocols you discussed, such as report building and narrative training, could be used for children who are also suspects?
I have found research where the NICHD protocol has been used on children who are suspects of criminal activity, and it does help them talk about what has happened and give the investigators an idea if they're responsible or not. Dr. Bruno.
As a follow-up to that, do you think using that kind of protocol would help to reduce false confession rate among young suspects?
I think as long as they're done properly, it is very easy to, because we tend to get very frustrated very quickly and tend to push children because they tend to have a hard time forming their words, so it takes them a long time to talk. So we tend to try to fill in their words for them. As long as the protocols are followed step by step like they're supposed to be, it should reduce that risk.
Follow-up from the other questions. For child suspects, who gets first dibs, I guess? Is it somebody that's trained in the NICHP, or is it the investigator that would be the first point of contact? And can a child waive their Miranda rights without a parent present?
I don't know about a child being able to waive Miranda rights. I'd have to ask any of my criminal justice professors about that, but when it comes to whoever gets access to the child first, technically there is no, you have to use these protocols. Mm-hmm. There is no set instructions that these protocols need to be used. Mm-hmm. So if an investigator or a detective is interviewing the child first, they might not be used. If a social worker who is trained in these protocols is interviewing the child first, it could make the difference. But actually, these protocols are not widely known about among investigators.
So police don't really use them? Okay.
I don't know. I actually do not know the amount for how much police use. That'd be interesting for me to find out. I want to look that up. Any other questions? Dr. Crowell?
To add clarity, kids can waive their Miranda rights, so as long as there's also consent from a parent or legal guardian as well. So both would be needed. I asked to, just out of curiosity, this is somewhat similar apparently to your research. Are you by chance familiar with the Stephen Avery case?
Yes.
You are.
Dr. Verna would get very mad at me if I said no, I wasn't.
He made a Murderer, the Netflix 10-part main documentary series, which basically depict the trials and tribulations of Stephen Avery in his criminal case. Well, as a follow-up, as you may or may not know, the investigation of, while he wasn't a child, he was still someone who was by many accounts mentally unstable. I'm not talking about Mr. Avery himself, rather his nephew, Brendan DAS. What are your perceptions of that particular interview, how it unfolded, and just how suggestive, in the opinion of many, those questions were?
Based on time, I can't really get into my entirety of my feelings on it. I want to make sure Chris has enough time to give his presentation. But I do think that even using these protocols for people who have trouble with their language difficulties or people who aren't able to get their thoughts together as well, it could still be helpful. Especially I actually did a practice interview with my cousin who does have autism, and he was picking up on the suggestive questions I was asking him very quickly. So I think that it's important to not use any sort of suggestive questioning with adults who have special needs as well as children.
Can I clarify, when you say picking up on suggestion, you mean accepting them, right? You accept the suggestion,
Yes.
not picking up, like, you're trying to lead me and you went against it.
All right, thank you.